right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming today to Trimming the Sails and Setting a New Course, a strategic approach to journal deselection and reorganization. My name is Vanessa French. I am the Associate University Librarian for Library Access and Collection Management at Lehigh University.
I'm Jason Moore, Electronic Resources Librarian at Lehigh. I've been there for about 8 months, and this was actually probably my first big project at Lehigh.
So code of conduct that they're forcing us to keep in the slide template, so everyone behave. Okay.
So I'll talk a little bit about just some basic facts about Lehigh. We're located in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Our student body is about approximately 7,700 students, 5,900 of which are undergraduates, and the other 1,700 are graduate students. We have over 600 full-time faculty, and our bound journal collection, which is what we're primarily talking about today, consists of approximately 5,000 titles, and they're stored across 3 different locations, one of which is an off-site storage facility, and we'll talk about some of the challenges around that.
Yeah. So I started at Lehigh a little over a year and a half ago, and when I started, I was basically told everywhere needed to be weeded, everything needed to be weeded all at once. So this is one of the things that we started. We also have some monographic weeding going on, but this project is very specifically focused on our journal weeding, which we felt like we could do simultaneously to whatever we've got going on with monographs. So the goals of this project were to reduce our print journal collection, our bound print journal collection, to make room for other collections and other space planning options. Our goals were to make sure that we did the weeding responsibly, making sure that we retained scarcely held material while discarding things we already had perpetual access to or could easily get through interlibrary loan or were not relevant to the collection. We also very much wanted to do a holistic look at our journals. So as Jason mentioned, we had journals in 3 different locations. And I very much, knowing that all 3 needed to be weeded, wanted to do them like find a way to do them all at once as opposed to weeding journals over here and then going over here and then going over here. So as far as the process goes, we wanted to make sure that the project didn't stall and that we were working towards improving the accuracy of our library catalog at the same time. Okay, so the requirements I had for this project were making sure that all the relevant stakeholders were involved, including our metadata and cataloging team, our access services team, our subject selectors, that the student workers that were helping us with this project were removing the selected materials and only the selected materials. We wanted to make sure that the project moved along at a good clip so there would be enough work for us to hire student workers to do and to do the physical labor. And we also knew that we needed to time the removal work to correspond with our academic breaks to minimize the disruptions to our patrons.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about our little nautical themed timeline here. So, we've got the waves there, different parts of starting our journey and through actually, setting sail. So in February 2025, we started working with our metadata team lead, whose name is Lisa McColl. She's not here today, but I just wanted to make sure she got a shout out because she was really instrumental in this process. So we generated a holdings report that we could compare our existing holdings with our existing retention commitments through a variety of programs. Vanessa will talk about the details of that in a little bit. And from there, we moved on to review electronic backfile purchases for a snapshot of our holdings with perpetual access. And then once we identified some titles with perpetual access and no retention commitments, that led to drafting our weeding recommendations, which were then sent to subject selectors for feedback. And after that, and we had a list of titles to deselect, our access services team began the process of deselecting those titles and physically removing them, and then followed up by our metadata team updating catalog records and holdings, which is ongoing. And which is also ongoing. The journal's ending up in the dumpster. So.
Okay, so thus we embarked on the journey to gather data. So the first port of call was how did our print holdings compare with what other libraries had in print? So the first step was generating a list of all of our print journals, regardless of which building that they were stored in. We're a folio library, so I asked my metadata services manager, Lisa McCall, to generate a report using MetaDB with all the relevant information about our journals, including OCLC number, ISN, call number, holding statement. This work was done around February. And at that time, the CRL paper database had a comparison tool that allowed you to compare a file to a database matching on either an OCLC number or an ISSN number. So during this summer, they did some sort of migration to a new platform, the TEND platform, and I haven't seen the comparison tool reappear since the migration has happened. And my email about that, because of course I have this scheduled to present. I always want to tell people the update. That has gone unanswered. But at the time, it was very useful to just upload a file and have an output based on one of those two data points. So the way it worked at the time is the comparison tool generated two file outputs. The first was a list of all the journals that I had uploaded that had no retention commitment matches within the CRL paper database. And then the second file was an output of every retention commitment that it matched to for all of our titles. So if you can imagine it, there's 52 different retention programs that are contained within the CRL paper database. Some of those programs have multiple retention commitments for different holdings ranges on titles. So the output file was like ginormous and overwhelming for our 5,000 individual journal titles. So because that was so unmanageable, I selected 4 specific retention programs to compare our holdings for. Some of the retention commitments that are in the CRL paper database are also regional, so it didn't really help me in Pennsylvania to compare what was being retained in California, for example. So the 4 programs I decided to compare our holdings to were East, Linda Hall, CRL JSTOR, and CRL Serials. So I wanted to create a master journals list that contained all the pertinent information to the deselection decisions. So I used Excel's text join functionality to merge the holding statements from the same retention commitment program into a single summary holding statement for each of the 4 programs identified. And then I used Excel's index match formulas to bring the summary statement into columns in the master journal sheet. So I don't know how well you can see this. I can't tell how well you can see that screenshot, but you can see CRL JSTOR has its own column, CRL Serials, East, so on, so on. Additionally, if a title appeared on the no retention commitment output file, I wanted that indicated as well. So I used the index match formula to add X's to the columns on the sheet to indicate that as well. So that's what that no reg retention column meant. Okay. So it was also important for us to get some sense of the scarcity of the print journals. So we used an OCLC API tool to look up the number of holdings for each OCLC number and copied that information into the column as well. So you can see where it says OCLC holdings, that's the number of holdings on those records, on those journal records.
Okay, so the next part was comparing our e-holdings to our print holdings with a focus on determining what we had perpetual access to. So I began the process of doing that, and throughout that process it evolved in different tools ended up being utilized, different approaches for a number of reasons that I'll discuss. So I just wanted to give a little overview of some of the tools that we used, which are OpenRefine, WorldCat's Collection Manager, even though for our holdings, when it comes to linking, holdings management, we do use EBSCO's HLM, but the WorldCat Collection Manager came in for a number of reasons that I'll talk about. And along with that, we used WorldCat's Discovery API and one little Python script, and we consulted Gemini for a little bit of advice on how to develop some of those tools that we don't have the technical ability to do ourselves. So to begin reviewing the perpetual access entitlements, I would have liked to have a holistic picture of our perpetual access holdings, but due to periods of rapid change in processes, personnel, and also systems that were used, that wasn't really possible. So we decided to stick with large backfile purchases that had, relatively static title lists and coverage, and that gave us somewhere to start at least and have a net that we could cast. So, in order to do that, we needed to review the license terms for those that corresponded with those backfile purchases, also the title lists and our own holdings to make sure that everything corresponded with each other. We needed to make sure that our holdings in EBSCO's holdings and linking management were accurate with the coverage because, obviously we don't want to say we have perpetual access for these years and it turns out like through linking it's not accessible and then, we throw something out and find that out later on. So that, due to some of the other things I mentioned a moment ago, just the changing nature of the office that I work in, there was a lot of historical information that that wasn't well documented. So we needed to develop a process for documenting that in the future for when we do another project like this one. So here's a few of the things that we looked at. So yeah, we had Coral was kind of it's now defunct as of Friday, our open source ERM system that we were using that contained a lot of scanned licenses and other historical information. And then we also had some paper files laying around, old shared drives that nobody's using anymore, but stuff's still in there. And even, there was a period of time where, my responsibilities as an electronic resources librarian were being done by committee. So there are people who are still around who have a lot of historical emails that I had to convince them to forward me in order to use. So we were, I was confronted with a lot of basically just really unstructured data for some of these title lists and things for, if it's a backfile purchase that happened in 2007, and I don't see it in HLM as a package already, and there's no publisher KBART file that I can find, then I just have maybe a scanned license agreement with an appendix that has a title list on it, and I needed to use that somehow, either manually, and if it's a long list, that can be painstaking, or figure out a way to automate that. So one of the things that we're doing ongoing is just making sure that every license agreement that we have on file and documented is scanned in OCR so that we can they're actually searchable, because a lot of them aren't. So that's a small thing, but it really helps out. So then, once I had all of that together, that's when we start, comparing the title lists and when possible, actual KBART files and spreadsheets that vendors can provide to the holdings that we have documented in EBSCO's holding and linking management to verify that the coverage information is correct and updating it when it isn't, and ensuring that we have some kind of like single source of truth when it comes to trying to provide this information to selectors and making these weeding decisions. So in order to do that, one little thing I did is we created a Python script that can, if you have a license agreement, you can that's OCR'd, and there's like an appendix with a table and a title list. You just copy and paste that into a text file and run the script, and it just extracts the ISSN numbers so that you can have like a CSV file. It's just one column with just ISSN numbers, and you can say, well, these are in this license, and if it's a backfile purchase, then the dates are roughly the same, or at least the starting date or something, or the ending date of it, of access is the same, then, you can say, I know that I have from, issue 1 to this date for all of these titles. And I'll take this moment just to mention that at the end of the presentation, the last slide, there's a QR code. We built a little site that just has some of the Excel formulas that we used, some of the OpenRefine GREL expressions that we used for these API calls, and this Python script and that type of thing for reference. So, and I just realized that we are going to have to try to play the video from PowerPoint because I didn't do that. So we've got a video here that just shows the little Python script that I made in action, and I'm going to cross my fingers that it actually plays. So yeah, I mean, if you can see it here, maybe you don't need to see it that close, but it's just copying this title list, pasting it into a text file there, saving it with the .txt file extension. The Python script is in the same directory that it's saved to. So you just save it to that directory, and then I go into the folder there, I run the Python script. You'll see it in a second. It's going to generate an output file, and so it's pretty simple. Once you don't have to necessarily have coding experience to do this kind of thing. If you can recycle somebody else's script. So yeah, there you see it's going to be a single column with the ISSN numbers there. Okay, so as I said before, we didn't really have a good workflow for documenting perpetual access. So in terms of doing it in HLM or having a single place where we can say, what are the titles that we have perpetual access to and what are the dates, right? So we just used the user-defined fields in HLM, 3 of the 5 of those, to document what type of perpetual access a title might have, and if it's post-cancellation access, when the initial subscription to that was, and having the mechanism when you cancel something to go in and say, this is when it was canceled. So if EBSCO's automated holdings management doesn't work for some reason, which it often doesn't, then you can say, well, I know it should be this. Okay, so for a few different reasons, we ended up not using HLM's APIs to extract coverage information to put into our big analysis spreadsheet, which was the next step, for some issues with the APIs themselves, and also some issues with the coverage being incorrect. So we ended up going with OCLC Collection Manager. We could find for most of these backfile purchases an existing static package that we could select, and then we'd be able to query that through the API. So we just went in and selected those packages. We have access to it with our cataloging subscription. I think everybody that has a cataloging subscription has it. So, whether you use it or not, our catalogers do use it for ebook mark records. So it's just there, and it has journal content in it as well. So in OpenRefine, we use the GREL language, which is the general refine expression language, to make an API call. So that you're seeing here is a function in OpenRefine where you add a column to a document by fetching a URL, so doing an API call. And then over here on the right, you're seeing a response when we say take an ISSN number for a journal, do an API call on a specific package. In this case, it's JSTOR, and you can see what the coverage is there that I've got highlighted, and then we just extract that information into a cell, which you see here. So that can be then brought into the big master spreadsheet that Vanessa had been working on. So, once we do that, then we can do it for every package that we've identified. We have all the titles. Every title has that coverage statement for the packages that they're in, and we could take that as a CSV file, take the column, since I haven't sorted it. The data that I'm using in OpenRefine is that spreadsheet, so if I don't change the sorting or anything, I can just copy and paste that column into the master spreadsheet with the, or those columns with the coverage information, and use the text join function in Excel to merge all those columns together. Initially, we were using concatenate, which just, if we want to put a delimiter in there, if there's a empty cell, it just puts a delimiter in there, right? Or like several delimiters. So we use text join, semicolon as a delimiter between the different coverage statements, and then we just have one column with all those coverage statements for each title. And then I'll pass it back to Vanessa about the decision-making process.
Okay, so having gathered all the relevant information, it was time to plot the course forward. Okay. After the data gathering was complete, I felt that we had all the information we needed to make decisions, but the amount of information was overwhelming. Additionally, we wanted the subject selectors to have input on the weeding decisions, but I kind of felt that if I just gave them the spreadsheet as it was and dumped all the information on them, the project would come to a screeching halt because just analysis paralysis. So what I decided to do was to go through the list myself and make some initial recommendations and then ask the subject selectors to review the recommendations and either make changes to it based on their discipline-specific information and their information about our curriculum, or approve the approve the change. So to deal with the amount of information I had to sort through myself, I created some guidelines for myself for all the titles. So anything with less than 100 OCLC holdings, I decided to recommend to retain. Anything that had no registered retention commitments from the CRL paper database or had no registered retention commitments with the 4 specific programs I had decided to compare our holdings to, I made the recommendation to retain. Anything where there was substantial overlap with our perpetual online access, I recommended to discard. I recommended to discard anything if there was a substantial overlap with at least one of the 4 identified retention commitment programs. Okay. So next I broke down the list by subject selector. So if you remember, part of the initial output included call numbers for our journals. We also have a call number mapping sheet that basically says this call number range goes to this subject selector and so on. So I broke down the sheet by the subject selectors using the call number mapping tool we have. I made some formatting changes to the sheet after I had made recommendations for all of the titles within the subject selectors area, like formatting the color of the cells so they could easily see what had been recommended to weed or discard. I uploaded those subject selector specific sheets to Google Drive, and I shared them with the subject selector. I emailed the subject selector the information about what was contained on the sheet, how to read the sheet, as well as the methodology that I just said on how I made weeding recommendations. And I asked them to review the entire sheet. And what was really important to me to reduce any problems with the workflow is for them to make any changes they wanted to the sheet, but to approve the whole sheet when they gave it to me, not little dribbles at a time. Like, give me the whole approved sheet. Okay. So next, after the decisions were made, after the subject selectors approved their sheets, it was time to jettison the material. I created 3 new Google Sheets for each library location where we were weeding from, and pasted only the areas that were, only the titles that had been selected to discard onto that sheet to create what I'm calling our working spreadsheets. These are the sheets that my metadata team and my access services team would be working with while they were actively discarding the material. And I did this partly to reduce the confusion for our student workers, but also so the approved subject selector sheets didn't risk getting edited by somebody else by accident. Okay. So, because there were multiple steps in the removal process and responsibilities shared across teams, I added 3 new checkbox columns to denote the task, to denote whether a task for a particular title had been completed or not. We also added new note fields to the sheet so the teams could easily communicate when they were working with each other what had any sort of discrepancies, any sort of questions that came up, easy for them to note. Okay. So our student workers were doing the bulk of the heavy lifting. They would review the sheet of materials for the location they were working at, pull the items to tables for the metadata team to review. The students would also note on the sheet whether they found more or less of the volumes than they were looking for. I would say we found quite a bit of discrepancy between what the catalog said we had and what seemed to actually be on the shelves. So, but I'm sure none of you will have that problem. Our metadata team would review the pulled materials and confirm that the correct items were pulled and evaluate whether any additional volumes that the students had found were in fact additional volumes we didn't know we had, or whether they were title changes that the students didn't have the expertise to identify. They would also update folio and our OCLC holdings to ensure that the discards were noted, and they would add notes to the sheet if there were any relevant information that needed to be followed up upon. After the metadata team had signed off on the journal volumes, the students would stamp the items for discard and put them in blue bins that we had temporarily located to the weeding area. When the blue bins were full, which was multiple times a day sometimes, one of our library coordinators from the Access Services team would submit a facilities request for the bins to be emptied to our responsible recycling dumpster on the Mountaintop campus. So where are we now with this process? 3 of our 6 subject selector lists have been approved and their items have been removed. Over 790 linear feet of material have been cleared from our material so far, and the bigger lists that we still have to do, we have 3 subject selectors lists. I think as Jason mentioned, Lehigh is a very STEM and engineering school, and we haven't done the science selector yet, so she's working through her list right now. So we have 3 more subject selectors to go, and we're not really sure whether the list will be completed for us to start doing further removal work for the winter break that's coming up in like a month and a half, or if they'll have to be delayed until the summer break. In the meantime, we've kind of gone on a side quest to review our currently received print periodicals, standardize our bindery decisions, and update holdings in the catalog. Okay. So where do we want to go? After the journal weeding is complete, we would really like to evaluate how much space we've made. One of the questions that I got asked repeatedly through this process is, how much do we need to weed? Like people really wanted a quantifiable number. And I really didn't have a quantifiable number. I really wanted them to keep things that they felt we should keep and get rid of things that we should get rid of. So we're not really sure how much space we're gonna end up making in the process. After we finish the weeding, we would really like to evaluate whether there are scarcely held, rarely used journals that we feel like we should retain that should be moved to the offsite storage facility. We would like to investigate whether we can combine our journals in our libraries to a single library location as opposed to being split up between our humanities library and our science library. We are an EAST member, but we do not participate in the journal retention part of EAST right now. So we've discussed, after we've gone through all this work, making retention commitments of our own through the EAST program. I think they're doing second round soon, so we would perhaps like to do that. And our metadata team I would like them to also review basically the holdings of everything that we've decided to retain, because there was such a mess. So updating that and again, getting the catalog to accurately reflect what we actually have. Okay, and that's what we have for you today.
And I think we have some time for questions, right?
I think so.